Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're running a bit behind, so I'll be very brief. My name's Graham McFadden. It's my honour to introduce Neil Oakes to do this next presentation titled Examining the Economic Crisis, a Practice Management Perspective on What This Means for Your Firm. I was just mentioning to Neil that I think I'm disappointed that not every person here at the symposium is not in this room, because certainly this ought to be a significant issue at this time. Neil's been doing this sort of stuff for over 20 years. We're told that we don't have time to do the bios, but Neil should need no introduction anyway. So, ladies and gentlemen, Neil Oakes.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, subject to my ability to drive the technology. Beautiful. What I would like to do is talk to you about a couple of things. Firstly, a little bit of history. I started working with the legal profession in Australia in 1988. I was a fairly young consultant when we saw the last serious downturn, but it's still well and truly within my recollection and within the resources of my database to be able to talk about the sort of economic models that we're likely to see, particularly amongst small to mid-sized firms. I gather the majority of the people who are participating in this exercise probably come from smaller firms, so not necessarily top-tier or mid-tier firms. I'll make passing reference to those larger organisations, but I want to spend the majority of my time focusing on smaller ones. So if I got that wrong, that's my first apology, but I suspect I haven't. Now, first things first, I want to talk about some back to basics stuff, which is obviously a very important component part of managing during any time of challenge. Before I do that though, I think it's worthwhile just making a few comments about, I don't want to run through the whole, boringly enough, my undergraduate degree was actually in economics, so if anyone knows about the profession of economics, I probably know a little bit about it, and it seems to me that modern economists really have morphed into it's really an applied study of history. Seem very, very good at articulating what has happened and why it's happened. Predictive models, not necessarily all that good. I think like any recession or any downturn in the economy, you can fairly safely be, not that I want to be too cynical too early, but I think you can fairly safely be fairly sceptical about most of the mainstream economists that you and I have access to, most of whom are bank economists or most of whom are employed by some larger organisation that carries into this downturn some element of vested interest. There are very few people, with the exception of those who are academic economists, who are genuinely neutral when it comes to, if you will, an objective view of what is going to or what's likely to happen. One of the things that does concern me a little bit, if you look at the history of accurately predicted boom and downturn in the Australian, the US and the UK market, the only economists who have ever actually got it right all hail from the lunatic fringe. And if you actually listen to what the lunatic fringe is saying with its predictive models this time around, it's not particularly comforting. I think that the most sensible thing to do is just to rely on some logic. Now, looking at this logically, we know as a matter of absolute fact that economies cycle, beyond dispute. What's in dispute between commercial economists and academic economists at the moment is the nature and type of cycle. So historically, commercial people would have us believe that the Australian business cycle tends to operate in 5 to 7 year swings. The frequency of those swings is normally fairly soft. It's suggested though that those swings occur within a 70 to 80 year larger cycle. Now if that's the case, the last time that cycle turned down was in 1927 and it had all sorts of disastrous consequences. Are we going to see that this time around? No. Clearly not, because our economy's far better regulated. It's a far more complex and better managed set of systems than it was then. But is it going to be tough? Yes. Why would anyone logically assume that the biggest boom in recorded history, so the biggest boom since about the Doomsday Book, 1066, why would anyone assume that that's going to be back-ended by 12 months or 18 months of soft landing? There has never been a government in the history of the world that's prevented the inevitability of an economic cycle. That's a little factoid that's worthwhile bearing in mind. It's great to see governments all over the world acting, but I can tell you there's absolutely nothing that anybody has ever done to prevent a recession occurring when it's time in the cycle to occur. It may happen this time, but if it does, it'll be a first. Now, so having said that, I suspect that the smart firms are going to be the ones who are preparing for a fairly deep and persistent recession. I suspect that in terms of your planning, you should be looking at about probably 5 to 6 years. You and most of your clients, talking to those of you in smaller firms now, have probably been conditioned the same way that I have through our parents, that, you know, you put your money into asset classes like real estate, it'll always look after you. Real estate, you just have to hang around long enough. In our family, we celebrated my grandmother's 95th birthday a couple of weeks ago, and she told me something I found quite interesting. She said, if you sold your house, as she did, in Sydney in 1931, you could have bought it back for exactly the same price in 1953, which you did. Thinking of a 20-year dead flat, admittedly there was a massive world war in the middle of that, but thinking of a dead flat property market for an extended period of time would make most of us fairly nervous, because it's a central part of the majority of your businesses, I would imagine. So let's not assume that it's going to be gloom and doom by any stretch of the imagination, but I think you'd be pretty wise if you were budgeting for a downturn that was going to be probably 5 to 6 years, not 18 months to 12 months. You know, at the end of the day, again, applying logic to the whole thing, frankly, with probably the notable exception of Australia, the world's banking system has to be rebuilt. Now, I know how long it takes to renovate a 160 square metre terrace house, and if you reckon they can fix the world's banking system in a shorter time frame than that, you're probably not really on the same song sheet as the realists. It's going to take a very long time, and I think international economies are going to be challenged. In Australia, it's quite likely that we will see 10 to 15% unemployment. It's quite likely. So what's that going to mean to practice? A couple of things, I guess, looking at what happened last time round. So 89-90, when the economy tanked, the impact on legal practice. Firstly, a couple of things I should point out. During the last recession, law firms were nowhere near as organised as they are now, with the exception of Australia's top tier and the emerging mid-tier. If you go back to 1989 in the Brisbane market, for example, it was before the branded. I mean, this was the days when people used to say things like, "Oh, we'll all be ruined when the dingo fence comes down." As a New South Welshman, I always found that curious. But this was before the major national firms came to town. It was before consolidation of the major national firms. They were, in fact, trading in Australia in 1989. There were no national firms. This is pre those mergers. So it was a very, very different profession. It operated with very different levels of sophistication. But having said that, there are still some lessons we can take out of it. I've made the comment here that, in my view, sustained success in firms is ultimately going to depend on the commitment to management and the client mix. By that, what I mean is, firms who will do particularly well are the firms who are strategically in the right place. So I'm not here necessarily articulating you need to sell these particular services, but you need to have a very solidly galvanised, well-positioned culture if you're going to not just survive, but if you're going to do well in the next few years. Management people often talk, just as an aside, management people often talk about strategy. You know, you've got to have a strategic plan, well thought out, succession plan, all that sort of stuff. There's no doubt about that. Anybody who's endured an MBA will tell you, here's, you know, the approach to strategy. Well, I can tell you, strategy during recessionary times for lawyers is not going to help you one jot relative to organisational culture. If you can keep a group